Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Calandra Waters-Lake, and I'm the Executive Director for Wild Virginia. For those of you who might not be as familiar with us, Wild Virginia is a conservation nonprofit. We are dedicated to protecting and connecting Virginia's wild places. We work with communities and decision makers to improve habitat connectivity and preserve water quality, as well as empower individuals through our educational programs. Before we dive into this evening's topic, I wanted to hand things over to our board president, Ryan Wagner, to say a few words. Ryan?
Thanks, Calandra, and thanks everybody for joining us tonight. I'm pretty excited about the webinar that we've put together here. As Calandra mentioned, I'm Ryan Wagner. I'm president of Wild Virginia's Board of Directors. And just before we start, I wanted to tell a quick story about the organization. I first got involved with it about 10 years ago. The organization was in the middle of, we were in the middle of the pipeline fights at the time. I was new to the movement and I wanted to help, so I went out and started researching organizations that were having a big impact. I came across Wild Virginia. They were leading these coalitions and nonprofits. They were fighting state regulators by testifying in front of boards and such like that. They were even sort of leading legal cases, taking one of the fights all the way to the Supreme Court. So I got excited, joined up, and imagine my surprise when I found out it was two part-time people having all of this impact in the fight type thing. So today we're a little bit larger, got a few more staff, but I'd argue the impact that this team has is even exponentially larger than it was back then. So you're going to hear tonight about some of the threats to Virginia's environment, but also about the multiple programs and the plans that the organization has to address these threats. I just ask you to remember, and sort of as a reminder, just like back in the days of the pipeline fights, though, all this good work to protect Virginia's wild places, it takes your support. It takes money. We're in the middle of our annual fundraiser, end-of-year fundraiser. We're trying to raise about $40,000 right now. That's a pretty significant part of our overall budget. I guess I'd like to ask that as you guys are listening tonight to Dave and Jess sort of walking through their concerns for Virginia and their plans to sort of address these challenges ahead, if you hear things that either worry you or inspire you, please consider making a donation tonight to support their work. We won't be able to do all of this good work without your help. There's a QR code on the screen right now that's, it makes it easy to make a donation right now, or you can always go to our website, wildvirginia.org. It's easy to donate right there. That's really all I wanted to mention tonight. Thanks again for joining and for recommitting to help this fight in protecting Virginia's environment. So thanks for your support as well. Calandra, back to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Ryan. The work here at Wild Virginia is really important. And this evening, we're going to be talking about what we see for the future now that the elections are over, what we're doing, and how you can get involved. As I mentioned earlier, a large part of our work to protect and improve ecosystems is through our Habitat Connectivity Program. So I'm going to hand things over to our Habitat Connectivity Director, Dr. Jessica Roberts, to tell us more.
Thank you, Calandra. All right, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so we're going to run through my program. First, I'm going to give the basics of my program and how potentially the next administration, federal administration, may have an effect on our work here in Virginia, specifically for habitat connectivity. So just a little bit of an overview that's important for both mine and Dave's work and just our general work here at Wild Virginia is what the last Trump administration did for environmental policy. So this is very important to sort of keep in mind. And this is how we are really predicting potentially what is going to happen in the future for our programs. So for the last Trump administration, he attempted to change or remove 125 environmental regulations. And this is anything from land protections to changes to our major environmental laws, things like NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, and I'm going to be talking a lot about that. Removal environmental justice efforts, and just really an effort to remove a lot of what is considered when we look into environmental reviews of development projects, and less ability for the community and the public to public comment. So that's something that we really do a lot here at Wild Virginia, is we give all the information on how you can get involved and how you can give your feedback to government's decisions. And if we don't have that ability, then it limits a lot of our work. I do have to tell you, though, a lot of these environmental policies, and I'm sorry that the the writing is small. I'm going to describe it to you, but the images below are showing to you how many of these environmental policies, these 125 environmental policies, were actually overturned by our current administration or changed slightly. So a lot of these did not actually go through or were overturned in this current administration. Some are still also in the courts. So specifically for my work here at Wild Virginia, just in case you're new here, what we have in Virginia is we have a significant connectivity issue. So what that means is we have a lot of wildlife vehicle conflict in the state of Virginia. This is a map from State Farm Insurance. We are ranked 9th in the nation for wildlife vehicle conflict. So getting in car accidents with deer, bear, all kinds of things like that. We have a lot of it. It's quite it's a staggering number. It's about 60,000 deer vehicle collisions every year in Virginia, and just over 80 for in total, how many collisions with all different types of wildlife we have in Virginia. Our Virginia Transportation Research Council estimates that each deer vehicle collision is $41,000 in state and personal costs. Bear collisions are also on the rise, and elk collisions. We have elk in the south west of Virginia, and they're actually double the cost of a deer vehicle collision, and they are also on the rise. So what do we do about this? Is we want to improve our infrastructure for both biodiversity protection and reducing wildlife vehicle conflict, and increasing the flood resilience of Virginia. So how we do this is we do this via something called stream simulation. It's what Trout Unlimited does to improve our culverts and bridges under our roads. So what we would love to see is basically allowing for both aquatic and terrestrial passage, and that increased flood resilience is what we're seeing here with this underpass here. We're doing a lot of advocacy work on this issue in Virginia, and we have a lot of partners that help us out with this, including Wildlands Network, and this is a map we made, and we can include the link to that map in a follow-up email after this webinar. So you can see what the social vulnerability, flood risk, and connectivity. So green is wildlife movement, and purple is high wildlife vehicle conflict. You can actually zoom in to your House or Senate district and see how much flood risk, how much social vulnerability, how much biodiversity, how much wildlife vehicle conflict you have, and you can use that for connecting with your legislator. So specific things that we want in the legislation for the state of Virginia and the General Assembly is we want to mandate wildlife passage in all infrastructure and flood resilience planning. It's currently not in there. VDOT and our other state agencies do not need to input wildlife passage when they're doing new infrastructure projects or redoing old infrastructure projects, which is concerning since we're top 10 in the nation for wildlife vehicle conflict. We want to standardize data collection, so we want to have the best available data to identify where those wildlife crossings go. And we want to assure sustainable funding for our state agencies to be able to do this. So it's a large issue for our state. West Virginia is actually ranked #1, so our neighbors are high in wildlife field conflict as well. So we want to do our part in reducing this, and so we need a sustainable long-term funding mechanism for this work, because it's going to be a long time till we get this solved. So potential election impacts are, so the last Trump administration really scaled back in providing federal funding to environmental programs. Currently, right now, we have the Wildlife Crossings Pilot Program, which was developed through the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act. So we got $350 million for that. And really awesome is VDOT, because we have a Virginia Wildlife Corridor Action Plan, got just over $600K to advance that action plan through this federal funding. And then they also got some additional federal funding for a culvert project near the Rappahannock, around the Rappahannock River. So we have really already started benefiting from these federal programs. So a lot of that impact is not directly from state costs and needs. So potentially in the future, the next administration may remove a lot of this funding or at least not expand it. There is thoughts for this funding to go towards more infrastructure projects like border security, pipelines, things like that. So even though the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act may continue and we may see more funds be put into the future, it may go towards projects that are not specifically for things like wildlife crossing. So we may lose that incredibly integral funding to making our projects be possible, because these projects are very expensive and we need a lot of help, and it's going to be a long-term process. So we really need this infrastructure investment to also be ecologically sound as well. Another thing that happened in the last Trump administration was there's a little bit of a rollback with the Federal Endangered Species Act. So what happened here was they deemed that habitat that is critical for an endangered species, but technically that species has not been seen in that habitat recently, cannot be labeled as critical habitat. And this is actually pretty detrimental, because with climate change and increased flooding and increased wildfires, wildlife needs to move into different habitats. And so if we're not able to protect that habitat ahead of time and it gets developed, then this wildlife has nowhere to go. So having that rollback of that critical habitat definition was pretty serious to a lot of our endangered species. So right here we have the Roanoke long perch, and you can see areas in the yellow dots on the river where it is currently seen. And you can also see areas where it has great potential critical habitat. It's just not there right now. But with climate change, it may want to move into those areas at some point. So it's important to sort of protect all of that habitat. The Biden administration did roll that back. So critical habitat in areas where they're not currently located is allowed through Fish and Wildlife Service. And so this is really important if you want to put a road in a place that's really critical habitat to an endangered species, but they're not technically there right now, it can be argued for that development project to go forward. And lastly is the National Environmental Policy Act. This is a very important act in America, which basically a lot of our federal development projects, but also our state and some local projects, need to go through this process of creating an environmental impact assessment, especially if they're going to have really large impacts on the environment. But it includes lots of different aspects. These development companies need to consider plants and animals and wildlife, but also air quality, cultural resources, noise, things like that. And with the last Trump administration, they did scale that back a little bit. They got rid of what's called cumulative effects, and they made it a little bit more difficult for the public to have submit public effective comments. So, and they removed a lot of the environmental justice things through NEPA. So a lot of those got, again, overturned by Biden. So they're in effect currently. So we do consider cumulative effects through NEPA, which, for instance, if you have an animal that's endangered in an area and it's suffering from water pollution, but you want to build a road in its critical habitat, that's a cumulative effect, and that would consider to have more weight in that environmental impact assessment, versus during the last Trump administration, those cumulative effects would not really have any impact on whether or not that project needs to look for alternatives. So a really important law when we're looking to build roads and develop things like highways or widen highways, we really need those environmental impact assessments, one, to have more opportunities and just be very, very open for public comment. And we also want them to include these cumulative effects. So these are just things we need to watch out for in this administration and keep abreast of, and comment and fight back. And some things on the bright side, I'll go really quick through this. Even if we have sort of a rollback of our laws or we don't have as much federal funding, it means that we're going to be very focused on our community, our state-based conservation, and those are not all awful things. That's bottom-up conservation and something that Wild Virginia already does and works for. And so this really can increase the long-term sustainability of projects, even if we don't have a lot of that federal support. And also we have some potential new NEPA regulations happening where VDOT will take over the NEPA environmental impact assessment job away from the federal government. It has good sides and downsides to that, but we'll keep everybody informed of that. And then also potential more availability of private funds for these projects. So if we're not getting that federal funding, potentially we can look for other avenues of funding. So really there's no stopping us. And we just have to stay informed. Thank you.
Thank you, Jess. Keeping wildlife and people safe in Virginia takes a lot of work and collaboration, that's for sure. So don't forget to donate to help make those things happen. Up next, we have David Sligh, our director of our water quality program. Dave, over to you.
Thanks, Calandra, and thanks to all of you for being here. As I get my slides up here, I'll start by saying that I really intend to make 3 main points so that you won't miss them. The first one is, as Jessica said, we're not deterred. We know there are lots of risk and threats to things that might be attempted. I'll tell you that as somebody who was first hired as an environmental professional 44 years ago, I've seen lots of horrible ideas come along and go. And so, you know, we're prepared to make these fights. One of the first points is that the federal picture, the things that might happen, certainly affect all 3 of the branches, and we are prepared to pay attention to and to have an influence on those various areas. And as I say here, there are threats, but there are also opportunities that we can take advantage of. The other thing is that in our federal system, where we have federal and state regulatory authorities, it's important to remember that when it comes to water, especially, the state of Virginia has important authorities and powers that are actually broader than what the federal government has. I like to show the word Commonwealth because I like to emphasize the fact that our resources are our common wealth, that we have a right and a lot of power to protect. And as Wild Virginia has done through the years, we'll continue to insist that some of the current protections that may be or that are stronger even than the federal requirements, that they be maintained, and also that we continue to strengthen those state rules. Jess did a good job of talking about a number of acts, a number of laws, Endangered Species Act, NEPA, all those things obviously impact on water quality. But certainly the centerpiece of water quality protection in the U.S. is the Clean Water Act that was in its current form essentially adopted in 1972. And under that act, you know, we have a whole structure of regulations and practice that has gone on all of those decades. And again, there have been many attempts to weaken that. There will be, we are pretty certain, significant attempts coming up. But at the same time, we have lots of arguments as to why we need to and why we should maintain a lot of those things. And I put the word constituents here in parentheses. You know, we're all obviously constituents of the environment of clean water, but I think it's important to point out that there are lots of viewpoints. It's not just so-called environmentalists or conservationists who care about clean water. It might not be too easy to see, but this one graphic here that shows the graphs, What that shows is our communities throughout the country who, during the life of the Clean Water Act, have gotten more and more adequate wastewater treatment. That's happened in part because the federal government and the Clean Water Act required it, but also because that structure, that law, and the regulations under it helped communities to make those advancements. And so those are things that obviously have benefited us all and that we can make a strong argument for maintaining. The other thing is that, of course, appreciation of clean water and of the environment are not confined to one side of the political spectrum or another. There are lots of folks who are willing to fight for clean water and for our future, and we're prepared to work with all of those. The other main point that I would make is that when it comes to legislation, you know, we've seen some of the specific things that people talk about a lot. One of those is weakening, you know, rules and incentives for tackling climate change. And, you know, that may have some appeal in general for folks, but what we need to remember is that the arguments for these kinds of solutions, for these kinds of improvements, continue to get weaker or stronger and stronger as we go. Even on the economic side, you know, the fact that the cost of extreme weather events and storms and changes in the climate become more intense, more disastrous year by year. We just saw the kind of impact we had across the Southeast, but also that the benefits of making the transition to more renewables, that becomes more and more important and more attractive to us all. So it might be a philosophical idea that we should not move in that direction, but the practical, economic, and health benefits are all important for that. One thing too, I'd say is that it is easy to talk about reform of regulations and changing the laws in that way. But one of the things we know is that legislators sometimes they are swayed by those broad philosophical goals, but at the same time, they do pay attention in many cases to what's happening in their districts, in their states, to the people that they are supposed to represent. And this one that I have offered here, although it's on the state level, I think it's a really good example of how that can work. State of West Virginia, their legislators on all sides of the political spectrum saw that they had major problems in their water supplies with PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, which are very dangerous. And they saw the widespread nature of that. So on a very much a bipartisan basis, they adopted a new law in 2023 that was actually pretty impressive. So when they saw that their own folks were being impacted, they acted. And I think we can always make the case that those kinds of kind of frontline concerns can overcome some of the broad kind of philosophical ideas. Now, as far as the regulations, which of course they do the work in implementing and enforcing the broader laws like the Clean Water Act. And it is, again, popular with some people to talk about regulatory reform. In many cases, that's an attempt to do away with protections instead of so-called reform. It has been proposed by the president-elect that in fact, he would like to do away with 10 regulations for every new one that might be adopted. In the previous Trump administration, the idea was to do away with 2 regulations for every new one adopted. But in either case, this is kind of the definition of an arbitrary approach to how we do environmental protection or how we do regulation overall. The there's always an argument for improving regulatory approaches. But kind of the overall approach to changing regulations without specific reasons is simply something that I think we can easily make the arguments against. As just explained, some of the times these proposals under the Clean Water Act and other laws will be to keep us out of those processes, to limit our impact and our ability to make our own interest heard and comment. Weakening standards. And one thing that a lot of people look at is the less enforcement of the rules that are there. One of the things that we faced in our fights against pipelines here in Virginia and across the country was that there was an attempt to change the way that citizens and that states could be involved in protecting their wetlands and streams under something called the water quality certification process. That was, as just described, that was one of those things that was partly rolled back during the current administration, but it's one of those kinds of things that we're going to be looking for. Now, as I showed before, we've got the White House, we've got Congress, but we've also got the courts. And while Virginia is no stranger to resort to the courts to try to make the laws implemented and enforced the way they're supposed to be, one of the things that does not change through time, is that the science, the technical reasons why we need to protect the environment, they're not changing. In fact, the evidence, the reasons why we need to maintain those strict laws get stronger all the time. And so when it comes to trying to explain a weakening of those rules, the regulators, the folks who are trying to do those actions have to explain that. And one of the great examples that we encountered again during our pipeline fights was that, as you see here, a federal appeals court struck down a decision by the Forest Service that was going to allow impact damages to the National Forest and the Appalachian Trail. And the court said explicitly, we're doing this in large part because the experts, the scientists said this is a bad idea. And yet all of a sudden, the people who were making the decision overrode that. Those are the kinds of evidence, those are the kinds of problems that we can anticipate, that we can bring out to the courts. And I know a lot of people, when you think about the courts, you think about the Supreme Court, and that's obviously important. But I think it's just important to note that of all the thousands, tens of thousands of cases that are brought in federal court, including to the major appeals courts every year, less than 100 of those ever get to the Supreme Court. And while you can't really say somebody chosen by a Democrat or somebody chosen by a Republican is going to be totally predictable, that of course is something that we do look at as far as overall philosophy. But what we know right now is that the presidents from each party have essentially chosen half and half of what we have right now. So that's not changing immediately. We do have the chance to take advantage of those processes, those legal processes. One of the things in the past that has been a rule, what's called the Chevron doctrine, was that the courts gave a lot of deference. They basically gave the benefit of the doubt in a lot of cases to agencies to make decisions in the areas over which they had responsibilities. It was kind of a groundbreaking change in the last year that the Supreme Court changed or struck down that principle. But when it comes to agencies in a new administration making changes that aren't well-founded, that aren't backed up by the science and the logic, essentially. That change could, in fact, bend the other way. Agencies shouldn't get that kind of deference if they're making changes that aren't backed up by the law and by the science. As I said before, our place, the state of Virginia, the citizens of Virginia, our place in the whole structure of protection of clean water is incredibly important. And we have strong tools with which to look out for our own resources. Under the Clean Water Act, the states have a strong role. The federal government, the Environmental Protection Agency, can lay down minimum standards, but states can, and in many instances do have stronger requirements. And so that's been one of Wild Virginia's focuses as long as we've had a clean water program. That is that we want to, and we're insisting on, we have done for the last 4 years, and we're going to continue insisting that the current state authorities be fully enforced and that we even improve things like our water quality standards. And so with the concerns about changes in the federal government, our work in that realm becomes even more important. Just one example of the difference that we can talk about and that is of benefit to Virginians is that while the Supreme Court has recently limited the scope as far as the water is protected by the Clean Water Act greatly in a way that's not very scientifically valid, the state of Virginia defines waters that are protected extremely broadly. And so that's a great benefit to us. So again, I think, as I said, our clean water program, what we call our Campaign for Virginia's Water Future, is strongly focused on that state angle. And it is one that I think is going to be increasingly important in the coming years. And with that, I'm going to hand this back over to Calandra.
Thank you, Dave. Well, with that, we are actually going to go into our Q&A part of the webinar. Darby Dreyer is our intern and will be reading off our questions. Feel free to drop additional questions into the chat or the Q&A section.
So we'll start with, could you address what specific advocacy support the two programs will seek in the new year?
I can go. So for the Habitat Connectivity Program, with the General Assembly session coming up, so the General Assembly session for this coming year starts January 8th, and we will potentially have a budget amendment coming through that Senator Marsden is helping us with between 400 to 700K for kickstarting 2 other connectivity projects in Virginia. So that's something we are going to need help pushing for and getting accepted. And so this is just short-term funding. It's one-time funding. It's so we can actually go out for that federal funding because we need state match. And currently our state agencies and our localities do not have that state match. So this would be a good way to bring that about. So help us out getting the big funds basically for our connectivity project so we can put more crossings and exclusionary fencing in the state. So that's something I will be doing this General Assembly session. And then the other thing is hopefully, we don't have a confirmation yet, but hopefully we will have a bill or 2 in the General Assembly asking for those things that I mentioned before. So actually I can bring them up. Again, just so you have it. Here we are. So all three of these are hopefully going to be in our bills. This coming session is to mandate wildlife passage. So we're going to actually require our state agencies to basically have it under one of the scoping categories when they're thinking about an infrastructure project is they have to look into aquatic and terrestrial passage when building roads. So that is our most difficult one. But it's really good because it also helps us with flood resilience as well. So that is we're mandating our state agencies to incorporate wildlife passage into all infrastructure projects, and also standardizing our wildlife data collection. So we have a carcass removal application that VDOT's contractors use, and we want to expand that for the entire state. So we will want to require VDOT to expand that so we can get the most up-to-date data on wildlife vehicle conflict. And then, of course, requiring the Virginia Department of Transportation to have a department and sustainable long-term funding for wildlife passage programs. So right now they are having a problem with time and personnel and money to get these projects off the ground, but they do have a state agency published wildlife corridor action plan. And so we want to give them the resources to really make sure that the things that they publish in the Wildlife Corridor Action Plan come to fruition. So more underpasses, more exclusionary fencing, and maybe more overpasses as well. So I will need help with that. And if you are a Wild Virginia member, you will get our action alerts. So please do sign up as a Wild Virginia member.
Okay, I'll jump in here too. One of the things that we need help with is to continue an effort that we started a couple of years ago, and that is to get the state of Virginia to do its job in controlling what are called the forever chemicals. As I mentioned before, PFAS, the long name is per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. What you need to know if you're not familiar with those is that they're very dangerous in very small amounts. The good thing is that we know some of the ways that we can control those, and we already have some authorities that will allow us to do that. But the state of Virginia is so far not exercising those authorities. There are wastewater treatment plants, industries all over the state that we know are discharging or are very likely to discharge these dangerous chemicals. As I say, they're a threat in very small concentrations, and they accumulate. They bioaccumulate in fish, other animals, and in our own bodies. So it's really vital that we take strong action as soon as we can to control those sources that we know how to control. So that's one of the things. We're insisting that when the state of Virginia issues a permit for one of these discharges, that they require the right kind of monitoring and that they require controls on those chemicals. The other thing is that we know that wastewater sludge, basically the solid materials that come out when we do wastewater treatment, that they're being spread across the state on farmland far and wide. We also know that those materials almost always are likely to have PFAS. And yet they're being spread without any sampling, without any surveillance on what kind of threat they're causing to people's groundwater, to their streams, to the crops, and to the people who use those areas. So again, the state of Virginia has a lot of authority already, and we just need to insist and continue to challenge them to do what they're supposed to do, and we need all the help we can get with that. One other thing that another kind of pollution that everybody knows about is sediment pollution. It's what you see whenever you drive by a poorly managed construction site or a place where the mud is pouring off of development areas. And the state of Virginia, again, has failed, really refused to adopt standards and requirements that will control those types of things. So they're in everybody's backyard, and we are pushing the state to adopt new water quality criteria that will allow those problems to be assessed and controlled. So we have some very practical kind of approach in the water campaign, specific problems we know that exist and ways that we already have some authority to deal with them. So that's what we need your help with, and we're going to keep going down that track. Thanks.
Also, I may mention, I really briefly mentioned that the NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act, may, for transportation projects in particular, may be handed over to the state. So it's classically a federal thing for highways in particular. And so it might be handed over to state. Other states, I'm looking at it right now, like Texas and California, Arizona, Arkansas, Florida, and Ohio have already done this as well. So other states have done this. It's something that it could be good in a lot of ways. It could be bad in some ways. It could potentially, if it happens, protect Virginia from some of the federal NEPA reform if we're kind of taking that over. But it could make the process less able to defer to federal guidelines, and also in some ways they could make their own guidelines too quick, not allow for enough public comment. And so it's something just to keep aware of, that we're also going to be keeping aware of, is that it's potentially a good thing, but also we should have some guardrails on it in terms of making sure that, you know, all environmental considerations are used when scoping projects and looking for alternatives to projects for mitigation for development. So just something that we will also potentially be looking into.
Can I jump in one more time on NEPA? While Virginia is currently a plaintiff in a suit against the Forest Service over its implementation of NEPA, we're still fighting over rules that were changed during the last Trump administration and which have survived so far through the current Biden administration. But we're in district court in Western Virginia right now challenging those regulations because they don't live up to the standards of the National Environmental Policy Act. And again, what I'd said before is, you know, when you come up with changes to the regulations that you cannot reconcile with the overall statute, then we have a very good grounds for fighting those things. And that's exactly what has happened in this case. The Forest Service changed their rules, but did not develop the kind of factual, the kind of scientific basis that I mentioned before that would support those changes. And one of the things we've been fighting over in this court case is to get the records from the Forest Service to show what their reasoning was. They fought tooth and nail to maintain those records, to keep them from us. But what we found when we started getting them is they did not go through the kind of analysis. They did not have the scientific basis. So I just go back to that statement I made before, that frankly, the science and everything we learn year after year supports more protections instead of less. And we have the ability to continue to fight for those things to be strengthened.
Okay, next question. What are the things to be positive about going into 2025 when it comes to water quality and habitat connectivity?
Since you said water quality first, I'll jump in. I'll say again that we have great promise, and that we have one of the things that I'm proud of with Wild Virginia on the water quality front is we have an incredible coalition of people who work with us on this. When we first announced our campaign for Virginia's water future in 2020, We had 55 other organizations, local, state, regional, and national, who joined with us on basically a broad platform of changes that we wanted to make and that we continue to progress with. So I think that that combined strength and that focus that we've been able to help take forward is what I continue to be excited about. And as I say, I think we have a great possibility of making major changes here in Virginia. So that's what I'm excited about.
Definitely building off of what Dave said, we are not alone. I've never felt alone in any of this work. We have so many wonderful partnerships with folks through my work. I work to help co-lead the Virginia Safe Wildlife Corridors Collaborative, which is now a collaborative of almost 50 organizations, both national, state, community-based organizations, and we are all just working for these efforts. So I feel very supported and helped, and lots and lots of teamwork. I think the other thing is that it takes time with certain things for laws to be changed completely, or for something to change. So for the Infrastructure Act, the money is still there that we can still benefit from, and at least up until 2026. It's very doubtful that the remaining funds will get rescinded or whatever it is, because that Infrastructure Act is benefiting blue and red states. It's been just such a great just influx of jobs and better infrastructure, obviously. So it would be really hard to get rid of it. Again, like I said, potentially in the future, that infrastructure will change from things like wildlife crossings and clean energy to more pipelines and border control. So we have to watch it. But for that, the structure of that to remain is great, because potentially then with future administrations, we can bring it back to other types of infrastructure. So like I said, I still think we have some federal funding opportunities in the coming years that we can sincerely benefit from. And also that a lot of these infrastructure acts and things are like, BIL, IIJA, all of them are amazing. The bipartisan infrastructure law, all of them are really great at building our infrastructure, creating jobs. So it's, I think, going to be more of a fight and difficult to get rid of immediately. So there is some really great positive things. And then I think also for habitat connectivity in general, because it's such a bipartisan, nonpartisan issue, and it just has benefits across the board. I mean, it's the same thing for water quality as well. It's more hopeful to get state laws and more community-based conservation done, because habitat connectivity, we're really framing it in the way of it has better flood resilience, so better resilience from the hurricanes that we've been seeing recently, in addition to biodiversity conservation and reducing the wildlife field conflict. So I think I'm really hopeful and happy for that, because there's just so many benefits to both of our programs. And yeah, I think there's still a lot of support and just in general infrastructure for us to be able to do our job still left. So I think it should be okay.
This one is a little more specific, but are there many wildlife crossings in Virginia?
It's a great question. So there's only one crossing in Virginia that was built for aquatic and terrestrial passage. It's right outside of Fort Belvoir. We actually just did a field trip there with some legislators and some other conservation community leaders, which was really exciting. And you can look on our website for the news on that. So that's really only one. We do have things like underpasses in Virginia, but they weren't built specifically, or like culverts, but they weren't built specifically for wildlife passage. And a lot of them actually weren't built for really good flood resilience either. So we have a lot of work to do on our infrastructure that we currently have to improve them for both passage and flood resilience. Hence the bills for requiring it whenever we're doing infrastructure improvements and also getting funds for it. We have no overpasses in Virginia. We only have underpasses plus exclusionary fencing or culverts or things like that. But yeah, only one that was built for wildlife.
And our last question will be, how does PFAS get into water?
Okay. Well, as I mentioned, one of the avenues is through discharges from municipal wastewater plants or industries. They can come from operations or industrial processes where those materials are used in making other products, or where the forms of PFAS themselves are being produced. They can also come into our municipal systems, both from those industries and from a lot of the things that are in our homes, in our environment. So unfortunately, they have become more and more prevalent in society. So it's a big problem. But again, we always want to bring it back to what can we do and what can we do as soon as possible. And since we know those discharges and that municipal sludge that gets spread around our countryside, those are absolutely big sources. And so that's why we have started there. I'll make a point that when we're able to require controls on those kinds of discharges and the kinds of things where we have regulatory authorities, that those improvements, those requirements can move essentially back upstream. In other words, when it becomes more difficult to release these dangerous things than to get rid of them, then there's incentive for everybody in that chain to start reducing them, for the industries to stop producing them or stop using them in their processes, for us to make more conversion from products that use these things to ones that don't. So we feel like we're at the pressure point down here at the end of the chain where it's getting into our environment that can help build leverage going up that chain.
Well, thank you all for the great questions. There are obviously many challenges and opportunities ahead. So I urge you to join us in this effort, as it really is going to require all of us. Before we go, I would like to hand things over to our board's Vice President, Greta Lindemann, to say a few words.
Hello, everyone. I'm so glad you're here. And I'm so glad for your support to Wild Virginia that I know you've given in years past, and hope you will in years to come as well. As Calandra said, my name is Greta Lindemann. I started off life professionally in Virginia as a Virginia native, as a NASA scientist, and went on from there in a variety of endeavors around the Mid-Atlantic in both for-profit and nonprofit modes, always doing work that I hoped was good for the planet. But a constant thread in what I've done, which is there in Wild Virginia, is challenge. I'm a challenge junkie, but I also like working with really, really good people. So when I discovered Wild Virginia, I really felt like I hit the jackpot, because here was an organization that was doing the hardest work there is for our nature in the state of Virginia. And the people are just superb. Their hearts are as big as their brains. And I'm so proud of them. And yet with all of that pride and their great success, one issue with taking on such challenge that Wild Virginia does is we're not just leading the way, we're cutting the path forward, which is tough. It also means we are several years ahead of where some of our big would-be funders are in their thinking. So it's a challenge for us to get funds from sources that other nonprofits might be able to do. And that's where you all on this call are so important. Your advocacy support is vital for us, and your dollars, as you can spare them, are super important for us too. Something that I hope will make you feel good if you can give during our winter appeal and beyond is there's a direct relationship between what you can give and the outcomes we can provide. And that's something that you really can't have with so many charities out there that are huge and do good work. But here, you know that your dollar, when we get our next wildlife crossing, that's your wildlife crossing. You can put your name on it and so on. That will be your water that's cleaned up. You did it. So I encourage you to help us in the new year and also now during our winter appeal. Thank you so much for taking part. Please be in touch with any questions or ideas you may have. We love to hear from you. We want to know your names. Thank you so much. Thanks, Calandra.
Thank you, Greta. Very well said. And thank you all for joining us this evening. I hope you have a safe and happy holiday season.